I never thought the day I turned 68 would be the day I stopped existing to my own son. It was a Thursday in late February, the kind of cold that gets into your knees before it gets into your coat. I remember that detail because my knees had been bothering me since November, and I'd been meaning to see Dr. Harlow about it, but kept putting it off. I always put things off. My late wife Claire used to say that was my worst quality. She was probably right about most things. My son Nathan had driven me to the VA clinic on Route 9 for a follow-up on my blood pressure medication. Routine stuff. I'd been living with Nathan and his wife Rebecca for 14 months by then. Ever since I sold the house in Dayton after Claire passed. Nathan had suggested it, said it made more sense than me rattling around in a 4-bedroom alone. Said they had the space. Said he wanted me close. I believed him because I wanted to. The appointment took about 40 minutes. Dr. Harlow adjusted my lisinopril dosage and told me to cut back on sodium and walk more, standard advice I'd heard a dozen times. I thanked her, took my paperwork, and walked back out to the parking lot where Nathan had said he'd wait. His car was gone. I stood there on the sidewalk in front of the clinic entrance and just looked at the space where his Tahoe had been parked. For a second I thought maybe he'd pulled around to the other side. I walked the perimeter of the small lot. Nothing. I checked my phone. No missed calls. No texts. I called him. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I sat down on a concrete bench near the entrance. There was a woman pushing a stroller past me and she gave me a polite smile and I tried to smile back, but I don't think it came out right. I sat there and I called Nathan 2 more times. Voicemail both times. Then a text came through. Dad, Rebecca and I talked and we think it's better if you find your own place. Your stuff is in 2 bags by the front door. We left a key with the neighbor, Mrs. Patton, at 4:20. Sorry for doing it this way. I read it 3 times. Then I put my phone in my coat pocket and sat very still for a while. 68 years old. 31 years working logistics at a freight company in Ohio. 2 years in the army before that. A mortgage paid off. A daughter buried before her 2nd birthday. A grief Claire and I had carried together for 4 decades without ever fully setting it down. And here I was sitting on a concrete bench outside a VA clinic in Flemington, New Jersey, with $53 in my wallet and no idea where I was going to sleep. I'm not telling you this so you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because what happened next changed everything, and you need to understand where I was standing when it did. I didn't cry. I want to be clear about that. I felt something move through me that was bigger than crying, something cold and settled, like when a big storm finally arrives after days of pressure building, and you almost feel relief even though the storm is going to cost you something. I sat there and I let that feeling move through me, and then I thought about practical things because that's what I do. Claire always said I retreat into logistics when I'm scared, and she was right about that too. $53. No car. The nearest hotel I knew of was the Hampton Inn off Route 202, maybe 3 miles. I could call a cab. I could call my brother Gerald in Columbus, but Gerald had his own problems and I didn't want to be one of them. I could sit here until I figured something out. A man sat down on the other end of my bench. I noticed him because the bench was long enough that most people would have chosen to stand rather than share it with a stranger. He was older than me. I'd guess mid-70s. With close-cropped white hair and dark glasses despite the overcast sky. He had a wooden cane propped against his knee, the old-fashioned kind with a rubber tip, not the collapsible white kind. He was wearing a good coat. Charcoal wool, well-fitted, the kind you buy once and keep for 20 years. His shoes were polished. He sat very straight. He didn't look at me. He couldn't, I'd realized later. But he turned his head slightly in my direction, the way people do when they're listening. "You've been sitting here a long time," he said. His voice was steady and unhurried, the voice of a man who had stopped being in a rush some years ago. "I have," I said, "waiting for someone." I thought about how to answer that. He left. The man nodded slowly, like that sentence contained more information than its 6 words. Maybe it did. "I'm waiting for my driver," he said. "He's reliable, but the traffic on 295 is unpredictable this time of day." He paused. "I'm Walter, by the way." "Thomas," I said. We didn't shake hands. He didn't offer, and neither did I. It felt appropriate somehow. We sat quietly for a minute. There's a kind of silence that's comfortable between strangers and a kind that isn't, and this was the comfortable kind, which surprised me. "You have somewhere to go?" Walter asked. "I'm working on that." He made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "I ask because I have a proposition for you, and I'd like you to hear it before you commit to wherever you're working on going." I looked at him. His glasses were dark enough that I couldn't see his eyes. His hands were folded over the handle of his cane, steady and patient. "My daughter is flying in from Portland tomorrow," he said. "She hasn't visited in 8 months. We have a complicated relationship." He said this without bitterness, just as a fact. "She worries about me living alone. She's been pressuring me to move into one of those continuing care facilities in Princeton. I have no interest in doing that." "Okay," I said. "My driver George has been with me for 11 years. He knows my situation. But what I don't have is family around. Anyone who can sit across a dinner table and make it look like I'm not entirely isolated." He paused. "I'd like you to come to dinner tomorrow night. Pretend to be an old friend. Let my daughter see that I have people. That I'm not alone." I stared at him. "You're asking a stranger to pretend to be your friend. I'm asking a man who has nowhere to go tonight if he'd like a warm place to stay and a decent meal in exchange for sitting at my dinner table and being reasonably personable." He said it plainly, without any embarrassment. "I have a guest room. George will drive you wherever you need to go the day after tomorrow." I should have said no. Every reasonable part of my brain was running through the ways this could go wrong. But the concrete bench was cold, and I had $53 and a text message that still felt like a door slamming shut somewhere deep inside my chest. "Why me?" I asked. Walter was quiet for a moment. "Because you sat here for 40 minutes and you didn't pace. You didn't shout into your phone. You didn't fall apart." He tilted his head slightly. "Whatever happened to you today, you're still sitting upright. I find that reassuring in a person." George arrived 7 minutes later, in a black Lincoln town car, the kind I associated with airport pickups and funerals. He was a compact man in his 60s with a grey moustache and the expression of someone who had long ago made peace with being unshockable. He helped Walter into the back seat without making it look like help, and then he looked at me. "You coming?" he asked. I picked up nothing because I have nothing to pick up. I got in the car. Walter's house was in Pennington, a 2-story colonial on about 3 acres, the kind of house that had been beautiful for decades and was still beautiful now, maintained with the care of someone who believed that things worth having were worth keeping up. There was a wide front porch and old oak trees, and a flagstone path from the driveway to the door. Inside it was warm and smelled like wood smoke and something good from the kitchen. George showed me to the guest room, which had a real bed with a real quilt and a window that looked out at the oaks. There was a private bathroom with towels folded the way they fold them in good hotels. I sat on the edge of the bed for a while and thought about how I'd been planning to call my brother and beg for a plane ticket home. And instead I was here. I didn't sleep much that first night. I lay in the dark and thought about Nathan's text and about the fact that I'd spent 14 months being careful not to be too much, eating what Rebecca cooked, watching my programs in my room, trying not to be in the kitchen when they wanted the kitchen. When they wanted the kitchen, trying not to be in the living room when they wanted the living room. Trying to make myself small enough that they'd forget they'd agreed to something they'd come to regret. It hadn't been enough. I got up at 6 and found a kitchen. There was a coffee maker, and the coffee was already set up, ready to brew. George, I assumed. I started it and stood at the window and watched the oaks in the early light. Walter came in around 7. He moved through the kitchen with the practiced confidence of someone who had memorized every inch of a space, a hand trailing along the counter's edge, a step adjusted for the slight rise in the floor near the refrigerator. He sat at the kitchen table. "You sleep?" he asked. "Some. George makes the coffee stronger than any reasonable person should want it." "I like it that way," I said. He smiled. It was a good smile, the kind that reached somewhere. "Sit down, Thomas." I brought 2 cups and sat across from him. The morning was quiet. A cardinal showed up in one of the oaks and left. "Tell me what happened," Walter said. I hadn't planned to, but something about the directness of the question and the stillness of the room made it easier than not telling him. I told him about Claire dying 2 years ago, about the house and the decision to sell it, about Nathan's invitation and the 14 months of making myself small, about the VA clinic and the text message and the $53. Walter listened without interrupting. He held his coffee cup with both hands. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My son did something similar to me. Different circumstances, same arithmetic. The moment you realize you've been tolerated rather than wanted." I looked at him. "What did you do?" "I moved into this house," he said, "which I'd owned for 30 years, but had rented out while I was working. I came back to it." He set down his cup. "The question is what you're going to do." I didn't have an answer for that yet. Walter's daughter Simone arrived the next afternoon. She was in her mid-40s, precise in her movements, with her father's stillness, but none of his warmth, or at least she kept it well guarded. She looked at me in the hallway with the particular expression of someone recalculating a situation. "I didn't know you were having company, Dad," she said. "Thomas and I know each other from years back," Walter said. "He's passing through, helping me with a few things around the property." I nodded. Simone shook my hand and I could feel her assessing me, not unkindly, just thoroughly. She was the kind of woman who gathered information before forming opinions. Dinner that night was pot roast that George had been working on since noon. The three of us sat at a table that could have held 8, and Walter asked questions that kept the conversation moving, and I answered them honestly where I could and carefully where I couldn't. Simone talked about her work. She ran a landscape architecture firm in Portland, and gradually the guardedness in her loosened a little. At one point she looked at me and said, "How long have you known my father?" "Long enough," I said, which wasn't quite a lie. He's one of the most straightforward people I've ever met. Walter smiled at that. Simone looked at her father for a moment with an expression I recognized. Love that was wound up with worry and old complicated history. I'd worn that expression myself, looking at Nathan, before I understood that some expressions eventually become the last one you give someone. After dinner, Simone found me alone in the sitting room. "He seems better than he was at Christmas," she said. "He seems fine to me," I said, which was true. She sat in the chair across from me. "I worry about him out here alone. It's a big house. If something happened—" "He's not alone," I said. "George is here, and the neighbors know him." I paused. "He's proud. He's built a good life and he knows how to live it. The thing that would actually hurt him is feeling like his competence is in question." Simone was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You do know him." I stayed 3 days. On the second day, Walter asked me to read him his mail and help him respond to a letter from his accountant about some property he owned in Delaware. On the third day, he asked if I'd be willing to stay longer. "I have a proposition," he said. Those exact words again, the same tone, and I almost laughed. "Another one. A different one." He leaned back in his chair. "I'm 76. My vision has been gone for 9 years. I manage well, but there are things that are easier with another person present. Reading, correspondence, the occasional errand. George handles driving and the house. What I'm proposing is a formal arrangement. A room, meals, a reasonable salary, in exchange for a few hours a day of what I'd call administrative assistance. You're offering me a job." "I'm offering you a life, Thomas. The job is incidental." I thought about the guest room with the window that looked out at the Oaks. I thought about coffee at 6 in the morning in a quiet kitchen. I thought about $53 and a text message, and Nathan's voicemail. I thought about Claire telling me I retreat into logistics when I'm scared, and I thought maybe for once I should try something different. "Yes," I said. The months that followed were the quietest and most clarifying of my life. I read to Walter in the evenings. He liked history, particularly the Revolutionary period, and we spent 2 months on a biography of Hamilton that generated more argument than I expected from a man who couldn't see the pages. I helped with correspondence and with the property in Delaware, which turned out to be a commercial building he'd owned for 30 years. I drove with George to doctor's appointments and grocery runs, and once to Philadelphia for a dinner with Walter's former business partners. Men in their 70s and 80s who treated Walter with the kind of unperformed respect you only get from people who have actually watched you make hard decisions. I called Nathan once in April. he answered this time. The conversation was short. He said he was sorry for how things had been handled. He did not say he was sorry for the decision itself. I noted the difference. I said I was doing well. He seemed relieved that the conversation was going to be easy, and I understood in that moment that what he'd really feared wasn't that he'd hurt me, but that I would make hurting me difficult for him. I told him I'd be in touch, and I meant it loosely, and he probably knew that. Rebecca texted me 3 weeks later asking if I was okay. I said I was. I haven't heard from them since. I told Walter about the call one morning over coffee. He listened and then said, "The hardest thing about children is that you love them through all the versions of themselves, including the ones that are hard to love." "Do you still love your son?" I asked him. He had told me bits of that story over the months. A business disagreement that became a silence, that became a distance, that neither of them had found a way back across. "Every day," Walter said. "It doesn't have much to do with whether he deserves it." In October, Simone came back to visit. This time she brought her husband and her teenage daughter, a serious girl named Maya, who spent the first day watching all of us from behind a book, and the second day asking Walter questions about the 1970s that he answered with more detail than she probably expected. By the time they left, Maya had Walter's email address and a reading list he'd dictated to me on a notepad. Simone pulled me aside before they drove to the airport. "He's different," she said. "Better, more himself." "He's always been himself," I said. "He just has someone to talk to now." She looked at me for a moment. "Thank you, Thomas." I nodded. I didn't know what else to say. Walter's health slipped in January. Not dramatically, not in the way you fear, but in the small ways that accumulate. He tired more easily. He ate less at dinner. His doctor in Princeton adjusted a few things and said he was stable, but that they should keep watch. Walter was matter-of-fact about it in the way he was matter-of-fact about most things. He said he'd had a long run and he intended to finish it without fuss. One evening in March, he asked me to sit with him in the study after dinner. He had something he wanted me to hear. His attorney had come by that afternoon, a quiet man named Ellison who had clearly known Walter for many years, and who had nodded at me in the hallway with the easy acknowledgement of someone who already knew who I was. I hadn't thought much of it. Walter told me he had revised his estate documents. He told me the house in Pennington would go to Simone, which was right. He told me the property in Delaware had been placed in a trust for Maya's education, which made me think of Maya with her book and her questions. And I felt something warm about that. And then he told me he had set aside a portion of his investments for me. Enough, he said, that I would not have to worry about money in the way I had worried about it that day on the bench outside the VA clinic. I told him he didn't have to do that. "I know," he said. "That's why I did it." I didn't know what to say, and so I said nothing for a while. The study was quiet. The lamp was on and the oak outside the window was bare but would have leaves again in April. "You gave me a year of being less alone," Walter said. "That's not a small thing, not at my age." "You gave me somewhere to go when I had nowhere," I said. "We helped each other then." "Yes." He died in June, on a Tuesday morning, in his own bed with the windows open. George called me from the hallway. I went in and sat with him for a while before I called anyone else. The room smelled like wood smoke, even though it was summer, and I have never been able to explain that. Simone flew in that afternoon. She was composed in that precise way of hers, but her eyes were red and she didn't apologize for that. We sat on the front porch for a long time that evening, while George made phone calls inside. "He told me about you," she said. "The real story. About the bench." I nodded. "He said you were the most unsentimental person he'd met in years, and that was exactly why he trusted you." I thought about that. He was probably the most honest person I've known since my wife died. She was quiet for a moment. "He wanted you to have the option of staying here while the estate is settled, if you want." She looked at me. "He hoped you would." I looked out at the oaks. 14 months I'd spent in my son's house trying to take up as little space as possible. And here was a woman I'd known less than a year telling me her father had hoped I would stay. I did stay, through the summer, through the settlement of the estate, through Simone's visits that became more frequent and less formal. Maya came in August with more questions, and I answered what I could and directed the rest to books Walter would have recommended. George and I kept the house the way Walter had kept it, because it seemed like the right thing to do until there was a reason to do otherwise. Nathan called in September. He'd heard through my brother Gerald. I still don't know exactly how the information travelled, but small families move news efficiently even when they're not close. He said he'd heard I was living in New Jersey, in a nice house. He said he and Rebecca were thinking about the future, about finances, about how things change. He said he hoped there were no hard feelings. I listened to all of it. I thought about the concrete bench and the cold and the text message. I thought about Walter asking me to sit down and drinking strong coffee in a warm kitchen, and the year that had followed. I thought about the difference between being tolerated and being wanted, and I thought about how clearly I now knew the difference. I told Nathan I bore him no ill will. That was true. I told him I hoped things went well for him and Rebecca. That was also true. I told him I had nothing to offer him and that I wouldn't be in touch. That was the truest thing I'd said to him in years. And when I hung up the phone, I felt something settle in me, like a door closing gently rather than slamming, final but not angry. Just finished. There's something nobody tells you about being in your late 60s. Not the aches or the doctor visits or watching the world move faster than you want to follow it. The thing nobody tells you is that it's also a clarifying time if you let it be. You stop auditioning for things. You stop trying to convince people to see your value. At some point you understand that the people who need convincing have already told you everything you need to know about them. Walter knew his value. He'd built things and kept them. He'd loved people imperfectly and honestly. He'd sat on a bench outside a VA clinic in February and made a decision about a stranger in 40 minutes. And he'd been right. I think about that sometimes. What it takes to trust your own judgment about a person. What it costs when you get it wrong, and what it gives you when you get it right. I'm still in Pennington. The oaks are starting to turn now, and the mornings are getting cold the way February mornings were cold when this all began. I make strong coffee at 6 and sit at the kitchen table, and sometimes George joins me and sometimes he doesn't. I'm not trying to take up less space anymore. I'm not waiting for permission to be somewhere. I'm just here. And for the first time in longer than I can say, that's exactly enough. I've thought a lot about what actually happened that February. Not the events, but the mechanics underneath them. Why things unfolded the way they did. Why Nathan ended up with nothing and I ended up with everything that actually matters. People want to call it luck. I understand that impulse. It's easier to say I got lucky than to sit with the harder truth, which is that what happened to me was a direct result of what each of us chose to be over many years. Nathan chose convenience. He chose the version of family that worked for him until it didn't, and then he chose the exit that caused him the least friction. That's not a judgment. It's just the accounting. Every choice accumulates. The way he treated me for 14 months, the small dismissals, the invisible curfews on my presence in my own temporary home, the final text message sent while I was inside a clinic getting my blood pressure checked. None of that came from nowhere. It came from a long practice of treating people's needs as inconveniences. You don't get to practice that for years and then be surprised when it defines you. Walter chose differently. At 76, blind, living alone in a house too big for one person, he could have retreated into safety. He could have sat on that bench and waited for George and gone home and never spoken to me. Instead, he paid attention. He listened to how a stranger sat through bad news and he made a decision. That decision came from a lifetime of the opposite habit. The habit of noticing people, of trusting his own judgment, of believing that generosity returned something real even when you couldn't see what it was. What I keep coming back to is this: character is just accumulated choices. It's not a thing you have. It's a thing you build or fail to build, one small decision at a time, and eventually those decisions become the person you are when it counts. I was not a perfect father. I was not a perfect husband. There were years I was too absent, too locked into work, too much in my own head to see what Claire needed or what Nathan needed. I carry that. But I also know that when things got hard, I didn't leave. I stayed and I figured it out, and I tried to be useful. That practice of staying, of trying, is what let me sit still on a cold bench without falling apart. It's what Walter saw. It's what changed everything. The intelligence piece is something I think about too. not book intelligence. I'm not talking about that. I mean the willingness to look clearly at your situation without flinching. When Nathan's text came through, I didn't tell myself stories about how it would be fine or how he didn't really mean it. I looked at what was true. I had $53. I had $53. I had no car. I had no plan. Starting from that honest place is what let me make a real decision instead of a desperate one. Clarity is a form of intelligence that doesn't get enough credit. And then there's the question of what you do when you have no good options. That's where I think most people underestimate themselves. You don't need courage to act when the path is obvious. You need it when everything is uncertain and cold, and the concrete is hard, and someone you love has just told you they're done with you. What I did was small. I just sat still. I didn't panic. I stayed open enough to hear a stranger's voice. But small things done right are how everything begins. And not the same man I was before that bench. Losing what I lost clarified what I actually needed, and what Walter gave me. Not the money, not the room, but the daily evidence that I was worth something to someone. That rebuilt something in me I hadn't realized was gone. The people who treat you as expendable are telling you something true about themselves. Believe them and move on.